Hi everybody, welcome to my channel, Life, Law, Bin. Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I have with me Mr. Rashad Brathwaite. He is an attorney at law who has been called 5 years by the bar in Barbados. He's currently actually amidst preparations to be called by the bar in Guyana as well. Mr. Brathwaite is also a research fellow at the University of the West Indies Cavehill. He teaches gender and the law and human rights. And he also has a keen research interest in discrimination and equality law. So today we will be having a discussion with him about his current legal path. Now, Rashad, how did this journey begin? Where did you pursue your LLB?
So I would have, well, first of all, thank you for having me on your channel. It's a pleasure to be here. Much long overdue. And I started my legal studies. I would have done law at the associate degree level. I just wanted to test it out, and so I did it as an extra subject. And then I decided that I wanted to ground my legal education at the University of the West Indies Cavehill, believing then in a sort of regional, the regional dynamics of the UE Cavehill being very important for the grounding that I wanted to have. So I would have started then at UE Cavehill. Yeah.
Where did you go? What was your next step after the LLB?
So after the LLB, I would have started at Hugh Wooding Law School, and then I was thinking about I wanted to go do my master's, and I remember narrowly, like minutes, missing the deadline for either Commonwealth or Achievement. And because I submitted it we had Mooton, and we were then a part of the Caribbean Court of Justice moot competition. And we'd had this really, really narrow window to participate. And so I just finished a training session and I logged on at 8 to send it. And I'm thinking that I'm 4 hours early. I was like, oh, nope, this is in GMT. So that happens. I go off to law school and I apply for the Commonwealth Scholarship, and I'm awarded a Commonwealth Scholarship while I'm still at law school. And so I leave for 1 year. I go to Warwick, where I then do international development law and human rights. We finish that up I submit my thesis in September. I fly back home through a rather interesting route. So I tried to see a little bit of the world. And then I started back law school at the end of September, and I've then completed my legal studies in May of the following year.
What a whirlwind of an experience. Now, you mentioned two key things there, the Commonwealth Scholarship, and you mentioned that you pursued your master's at Warwick University in the United Kingdom, for those who don't know. Now, for many of my viewers who have been following the channel, they do know that I focus a bit on scholarships and how to achieve those. What was that application process like for the Commonwealth Scholarship? And do you remember how you felt when you received that news, the positive news?
So thinking back on the process, it feels so long ago now, it being maybe seven years ago. But then in preparing for that scholarship, I thought about I think of myself somewhat as a storyteller, whether that is in law or I write in creative ways. And so I was then interested in telling a story that united my personal ambition with the national story of Barbados, and likewise with the British interests, because these scholarships that are being awarded. There is a development purpose for it, and so you have to make that alignment between your interests and what might be in the strategic interest of your country and the strategic then relationship between your country and that development partner, whether that is your Achievement Commonwealth endeavor, which Fulbright, whichever scholarship, that there may be some connections then between the larger geopolitical interests. So thinking then of at the time would have been around either the MDGs or SDGs, what connections between Barbadian interests, Caribbean interests, and British interests. And so I was, at the time, still I'm very interested in children's rights and addressing what was and what remains to be concerning prevalence of child sexual abuse, particularly throughout the region. But I think generally, and I look at this in the context of gender, the high prevalence of domestic violence. And so those two things are connected, right? And so it was then thinking through, how do I tell the story in a way that interests everyone? And I remember I was in Trinidad and I had to fly back to Barbados in order to do the interview. And then I walk into a room with kind of no sense of what to expect. And there were 8 people in the room. And so you sit, and then there's this barrage of questions. And I left and I went home, and I was happy to be back home for a little bit because I was then in Trinidad studying. And I fly back to Trinidad and I go back to school the next morning. And then months later, I get an email, I think, and I was like, this is too good to be true. And so like I remember I'd just come home from evidence and I was like, but what does this mean? Is this real? And so I just remembered a very profound sense of happiness that I was going to be heading off to Warwick, which I had been madly interested in because of its critical perspectives that I felt was a good mix of. I described some of the other universities as kind of the core curriculum offering were your classical kind of grammar school. And so they're like very pure subjects. And Warwick allowed me that balance of new and innovative approaches. And so as a person who was interested in civil society, there were courses like approaches to global justice, then there's civil society and activism and the law, and all of these interesting courses that then tied what at the time felt like very personal interests that I wanted to pursue, grounded in the law, but yet broader than or kind of traditional doctrinal understandings of law.
So this leads perfectly into me inquiring about your experience in the UK. Obviously, it sounds as though you had a great experience academically at Warwick, and I'm glad to hear that. But what about your living experience? How was that adjusting? Did you miss home? Was there any homesickness at all?
So being away from Barbados for the 1 year in Trinidad, otherwise having lived most of my life in Barbados, subject to travel, that year of adjustment in Trinidad, then I probably spoke more to my parents and to loved ones while I was in the UK than when I'm home. So there were those kind of regular Skype calls. Skype was in then, not Zoom. And so there was less of that missing of home, though for sure there were things that I missed profoundly about home, as I then experienced in the context of the UK. So they're little things. It's the silence of the UK was deafening actually. And so coming into my room and it's just like it's really, really quiet. And a friend of mine who I think who did his studies at Edinburgh, both of us developed tinnitus or tinnitus, however you decide to pronounce it. And we would joke that was the sound of the crickets and the western frogs from home, because so then the silence actually was also further maddening because that's when I would notice the tinnitus. So I don't notice that I have tinnitus when I'm in Barbados. But I certainly did notice it when I think I'd never had experienced it before, and I remember it was maybe 3 months in that it started. So there's little things like that. Then there, and I wrote about this for, there was this competition that was linked to Commonwealth Awards, and the the cultural mores are a little different in terms of the friendliness of the region, and you walk by and you speak to people and they look at you in the UK like, what's happening here?
Yes.
Um, whereas at home, I'd feel uncomfortable walking by and not speaking.
Yes, of course. Of course. Because I remember getting into a taxi. Every time I get into a taxi, I say, okay, well, good night. And one of my friends, she was like, why do you do that? You only say good night when you're going to bed. Why do you keep telling them good night? I said, well, no, it's the polite thing to do. I say good morning, I say good afternoon, I say good night. I've been here long enough now where the stares now don't affect me. I still say my greetings because I know that if I stop and when I eventually come home and I'm walking past people straight, it's offensive. It's impolite to do that. So I'd still say my good morning, but it's the culture. There is a cultural difference in terms of greetings and that kind of thing. So I definitely understand. And there is something that a lot of people don't mention too here in the UK, and it can actually have a negative impact on your mental health, and it's the weather. I do believe in seasonal depression. You recognize that. I remember one of my friends, she said to me, well, Nia, I'm tired of being my own sunshine. Sometimes I need a little bit of help. And I said, that is profound. That is simple, but that is profound, because every day we get up, you look outside and you see just, a gray sky. Recently, I looked out my window. I couldn't see anything because it was so foggy. And even you get up sometimes, even in the winter, it's 7 o'clock, and outside it's pitch black.
Yeah.
I'm just like, where are these people getting energy from to go anywhere?
So I arrived in the UK in late September, early October. And so at the time, the weather is sufficiently, like, it's nice. I can leave in home in like one layer if I feel like two, if I'm being kind of cautious. And then I remember, like, we would be in class, and then suddenly the daylight saving times happened,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, I would leave class and it would be um outside would still be bright, and then all of a sudden I'm like, but I'm leaving class and it's really, really dark, and so it was just this kind of, how is this happening? And so that's also then a bit of adjustment, beyond the kind of weather, the slight variance of British racism, um, you know, and I think in my experience, I unfortunately had bits and pieces that were a little more explicit, but not directly, but in relation to my friend circle. Warwick being a pretty diverse university, then my master's class, there were maybe half of us who were either outside of the UK, or were non-white. And so just this variety of experiences, whether it's, the subtlety of um, the sort of superpower that comes with always being able to keep a seat around you. If you take the bus, nobody sits close to you, that sort of thing. Or then there are a couple of other incidents that we won't go into. But beyond that, I had a really, really good time. I enjoyed the social life at Warwick. I had family in the UK as well, and so I traveled up to Liverpool and to Manchester, and then so I got to see a bit of UK. I came down to London, um, yeah, and we had. I forgot about this until quite this moment. So I had been a Mutin champion at home, and the I suppose at the time, Warwick's mooting program was less competitive. And so, by virtue of the CVs that we brandished, a few of us ended up participating in the International Criminal Court moot. And so, we went to The Hague, and that was good fun. Yeah, so I had a really good time at Warwick.
Yeah, that sounds like a great experience. But I cannot overlook the fact that you mentioned racism, and a lot of us, well, some of us are aware of it from home, from being at home. You're aware of the social dynamics at play, but there are a lot of people who leave the rock, affectionately known, BIM, and then they come here and they suddenly recognize they're Black or they're non-white because they recognize how they're being treated. And then they recognize, okay, I understand why equality for all is something that needs to be championed. I understand why when people say, well, look, we still need to always bear in mind our history and our past, I now understand why that's pertinent, as opposed to me saying, that was so long now. Why y'all don't forget it? Because constantly in this skin, you will always remember it. Someone will always remind you in some form or fashion. And
Right.
that's why I think it came to a fore where there was a discussion here in the UK after the very unfortunate incident in the States with George Floyd, where persons here were saying, well, the UK isn't innocent either, but it's just the subtleties. It's there, but they're very subtle, but I'm glad we mentioned that, because obviously I still don't want it to be a situation where people wander into a space blindly. You still need to know what's going on. You still need to be aware of what's happening around you and those underlying subtleties.
So I think beyond that, beyond the visceral experiences, um, there was also then and Warwick was a useful place in that the course was written, many of my courses were written from a kind of explicitly global south position, and therefore much more willing to interrogate norms of international law and the ways in which they're steeped in coloniality, etc. And that was an interesting transition because oddly, in the region at the time, we were much more likely to teach international law, etc., in a very black letter approach that then would see equivalent time being spent on topics like use of force, as well as humanitarian intervention, etc. And it was the one of the events that I remember most from class, and it was a colleague who was French, and we were all very kind of fun there. And there was this, we were talking about human rights, and she says, "But you should be glad that Europe gave you human rights." And I remember Papa from Ghana, he goes, "What did you just say?" And so then that led to, because it felt like an unconscious statement. And then we had to have kind of a collective reckoning about it afterwards over drinks. So yeah, then I was also interested in the ways in which the visceral racism that it exists in subtlety, that also then at times pervades academic thought. And yeah, that's something that stuck with me even now as I teach from within the global south, and then engage with literature that sometimes would nonetheless see you as less.
Yeah, of course. So we've moved on from your experience now in Warwick. What was your experience in practice? I know that when we spoke before, you told me you did some litigation support work. What was that like? Could you explain what I guess your daily tasks may be a particular
Right.
day?
So I'd done my in-service, and I wasn't fond of the excessive delay of the legal system. And having been in litigation department, your tasks don't wait for you when you go to court and you spend 5 hours at court and then there's an adjournment. And the environment at the time was not conducive to being able to do a whole lot while you were out. And one of the kind of lessons of COVID has been a pivot to the digital in a way that was always possible, but just was so disruptive of the status quo that it didn't make sense. One of the unfortunate things then about that is the historic ways in which, because we have often refused the accessible, then colleagues now within the human rights spaces for persons with disabilities, they're just like, these are the things that we've been asking about for the longest while that were impossible, and now look, they're possible. That's a bit of a tangent. But I knew that I wasn't interested in kind of your traditional litigation practice. And so having come out of law school and my master's debt-free, because I had benefited from a government scholarship, and there were a number of scholarships. I was a top student at Cape, and so I was comfortable, and I didn't have the immediate pressures of needing to start debt repayment, and so needing to fit into a space immediately. And so I had that luxury to be able to take a little time off, but then also to do the sort of work that I was interested in, whether that was my non-legal work. So I'm currently the president of Kiwanis, and I started my Kiwanis journey after I came back to Barbados after I finished law school. But during my in-service, when I was in the UK, I had continued to do a bit of work for an attorney. And so it would be your kind of general research. I'd get a very targeted question. I need to know the legal rules around this. What are the exceptions? And so I discovered that I actually kind of like research. I like providing the legal matrix that makes this case work. I like looking for the exceptions that may have been missed or the alternative paths. And I happen to think that I was pretty decent at it, and I hadn't had any complaints about it. And so I had started, which I'm still in the process of kind of formalizing, this research practice. And so I had clients from as far as Belize, looking at really, really interesting human rights questions, public law questions. And so, you'd get to, depending on the nature of the work, I'd get an email, I need this in 4 hours, or I need this in a week, but this will take you 30 hours to do. And so the research tasks, they varied. There were times when I was based in-house with a firm, and I was a research associate. And so there's, for me, a definite need for researchers, and there are a whole set of challenges that attend to research in the region. Limited access to some of the legal products, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the time, then in law school, I had access, and I continue to have access. So yeah, that was my legal research journey. And then that transitioned into consultancies, then thinking about law and development. So areas like professional development, compulsory professional development for attorneys, research on mediation and criminal justice. So there was this swath of interesting things that I couldn't tell you what I would be doing tomorrow, but I could tell you that it would be interesting.
Yeah, it seems as though that the varying research interests would definitely keep you intrigued, because it's not the same task every single day or the same aspect of law that you'd be researching.